Hey guys, it's Heather. I'm just here to present on a Screencast-O-Matic again about Spring Chapter 3, which is titled African Americans, Globalization, and African Diaspora. Before I begin presenting, I want you to all take a second to reflect. Take a moment, put yourself in the shoes of African Americans. Imagine that you lived in Africa and were stripped of your family, house, and everything. Now go ahead and make a short list of how you would feel. And you can go ahead and feel free to discuss those lists around the class about how you felt about that. Now the chapter begins talking about diaspora, which is a noun, which refers to people forced or induced to leave their homelands. And specifically, this chapter is talking about the African diaspora. And they mention 3 different types of people that were working within the United States and with Britain. The first, a slave, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And it is defined as a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. So a lot of the diaspora, the African diaspora, they were mostly slaves. Then we have free labor, the labor of a free man as distinguished from that of slaves. As I'll talk about later in the presentation, some of the northern slaves were able to become free after a certain amount of time and money that they were able to pay off. So then they became free labor. They were still working, however, they weren't necessarily the legal property of someone else. And then an indentured servant, a person under contract to work for another person for a definite period of time, usually without pay, but in exchange for free passage to a new country. So I know a lot of the immigrants that have come over, not necessarily African Americans because they were kind of stolen from their countries, but others who came, for example, the Irish came over to escape a lot of numerous things from their own country, and some of them were indentured servants. So they were able to come over to the country, have a place to stay, but they still had to work for someone else. Cultural transformation and the forced migration of enslaved Africans. So as you know from numerous history lessons, when we were trying to build the British colonies over in the United States, which is currently the United States, we went over to Africa and decided that we needed help with work and decided, okay, we are going to take people from Africa and use them as slaves to work for us. That began in the north, and that was the slaves are able to do a sort of assimilation in the north because there were often limited number of slaves who worked closely with white servants or farmhands, so they were able to become closer into the Americanized and European culture. However, it was isolated in the South. In exchange with whites was difficult for the slaves. People in the South were fear of revolt through literature, so those slaves in the South weren't allowed to read because their slave owners and masters were scared that the literacy would expose the slaves to abolition literature, which would give them the idea to run away or revolt. There are also larger groups that were just kind of completely isolated from their masters. Oftentimes they're working in plantations for cotton and sugar, and so oftentimes they weren't anywhere even near the masters for multiple days at a time to even have that visual communication of what the European culture was about. This allowed slaves to be compliant and inexpensive workers due to the laws forbidding them to have education and for those to educate them or to be able to read. Without that type of education, It was the ideal that slaves couldn't be smart enough to revolt or have any ideas to do so. And it was inexpensive because they didn't know any better on what they were able to make elsewise with the low skill levels that they had. And two other ideals on why they did not want to educate the slaves was to control the population after it has been conquered, and, like I said before, to deny and limit their educational opportunities. And then later in the PowerPoint, I'll explain in more depth how there was a lot of underfunding and segregation within African American schools once they eventually were established. Atlantic Creoles. So, like I mentioned before, the first enslaved Africans arrived at Jamestown, which was more on the northern side, and they spoke European languages, and also had Hispanic and English names, and sometimes had half African and half European ancestry. They were taken from trading posts along the west coast of Africa in a less harsh way. And then Creole, sometimes when you think of Creole, I think of New Orleans. However, it's defined as a person of mixed European and black descent, so all of these people were listed as Atlantic Creoles. There's a capturing of African wives and mistresses. A lot of them were taken to try and repopulate the area, so they were used to mate and to create more children. In the northern colonies or states, that created a cultural conflict. These Atlantic Creoles, once they procreated and had children, those children, which were even more so mixed European and of black descent, they were looked at as outcasts for adopting African traditions from the Europeans, and they had resentment. However, the Europeans also resented the Creoles for wearing clothing and copying mannerisms of the Europeans. So they didn't really want them to be like them, but they also would make fun of them for acting like their African ancestors. And then they were scorned by Africans, with no right to marry, inherit property, or own their own land. Then, in the United States and the colonies, they assimilated, like I mentioned before, and were welcomed by their purchasers or masters, They were familiar with the language and the culture, and would kind of be surrounded by that environment with their masters and purchasers near them. They worked side by side with the white indentured servants, so they were hearing a lot of English that way too. And the white indentured servants were able to be free after working a set number of years, while the Creoles could end up purchasing their freedom, which often happened in the northern colonies. Slavery and cultural change in the North, mid-18th century. Now, I mentioned before that they were taking slaves from the west side of Africa. They began to go into Central Africa due to the growth of the northern economy in the United States and the development of southern plantation systems. That increased the demand of enslaved Africans, and so we had to look elsewhere to get more slaves. So, like I said, slave traders began indulging into Central Africa. Africans there were often farmers and herdsmen that live in small villages with little to no previous contact with Europeans and differing languages and religions. Now I want you to close your eyes as I read you this. By the time they reached the Americas, if they survived the ocean trip, they were often psychologically devastated by the experience of being wrenched out of their villages, separated from their families, marched to the African coast in shackles, forced into the dark holds of sailing ships, and then sold to some unknown Anglo-American in a country that had little resemblance to their homelands. take a moment and imagine that you are one of those people. And feel free to pause me if you need to have a class discussion about that. So as they began getting multiple amounts of slaves, more slaves than they had before, enslaved men outnumbered the free white laborers, especially in Monmouth County in New Jersey. It was 262 enslaved men to 194 free white laborers. And as the northern slave population went up, it became more difficult to gain freedom. Because there were so many slaves, it was often hard for them to earn their wages and to buy their freedom. Along with that, these newly arrived slaves resisted the European culture, resisted receiving new names, while the Atlantic Creoles had already had Hispanic or English names from living in Africa. The new slaves from Central Africa did not pick up the European culture of religion. No one was Catholic, no one was Protestant. They maintained their religions from their country. Barely spoke English or spoke it poorly. However, the free blacks who were already there, their rights were severely restricted by new laws that arrived. They were not allowed to vote, attend the militia, sit in on juries, obtain legal counsel, testify in court, and they had requirements to carry special passes to travel, trade, and to keep a dog or gun, which was often a patch that they had to wear that said free on it. There also were some who read and wrote well enough to petition the Massachusetts General Council to try and earn more rights. However, that always led to be unsuccessful. Freedom in northern states and educational segregation. This section of the chapter, we talked about how freedom does not equal equality. A lot of these slaves became free, however, they didn't have equal rights by any means, like I mentioned before. After some of the colonists began to realize that, Pennsylvania began the halt of further importation of slaves. So we still had slaves within the country, but they were no longer growing with the slave traders and getting more slaves within the country. And British people who were still living in Europe thought it was ironic that these colonists were so far in the pursuit of liberty and freedom, however, they were enslaving other humans. So that was a big ironic joke amongst Britain. As progress continued, in 1785, New York legislature passed the bill for the beginning of abolition of slavery. Northern freed slaves were able to provide support for the Southern after the Civil War, since they were literate and educated. So the Northern slaves would go down after the Southern slaves had been newly freed, and they would try and teach and replace African cultures with American cultures through education. Not only was this trying to assimilate them into the culture, but also to help them catch up on their English and reconnect with each other. With the goal of education, this also began the start of racially segregated schools, and also the unequal school funding and educational opportunities between white and black schools. Mobs attacked integrated schools amongst protests by whites. So when they finally were attempting to integrate schools, mobs would attack, there would be mad protests, like I'm sure you've learned about in history class before. And there's also this movie, more like a documentary, called The Children's March. If you wanted to Google that and look into it, it's not very long, and watch it. It relates to this in schools and how children made a difference. It was really great. Also, segregation was necessary because some claimed that it would offend Southerners and encourage immigration from Africa to further explain the harsh cruelty of the laws. They were prohibited for interracial marriage, and